That is the correct button. Okay. We're in business. We're in business. Hey, welcome back. All right, so if it's cool with y'all, I think we can just jump right in. Unless of course, anybody had any questions about Proposition 2 before we start Proposition 3.
I think we had some, but we were waiting on Proposition 3 to resolve them.
Yeah.
And I also don't remember what they are, so let us proceed.
Cool, that's helpful. So before I start to Proposition 3, one of the things about it so Proposition 1 introduced the distinction between the one and the many. Proposition 2 introduced the dialectical relationship between the one and the many. And now I think what I want to make sure that we do is we spend a little time to talk about the nature of participation. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read Proposition 3, and then we'll get into that discussion. So let me just first share this. Okay. So there we go. All right. Pan to genomenon hen metexi tu henos genetai hen. All that becomes one does so by participation of unity. Oto men gar uk en esti, katho de ponte tin nepoke tu henos hen estin. Agar genoito hen de me estin hen katho to sinionta dipu ke koinunto ke... I should have prepared. I should have read this before. Koin onunta alilois genetai hen, ke hippomene tin tu henos, parusen uk onta oper hen, meteke ara tu henos, taute, I pasque to hen genetai. I men gar ide estin hen u genetai hen, togar on u genetai o ide hen, or ide estin. I de genetai ek tu mi henos proteron exe to hen genomenu tinos en otos henos. Oof. It's tongue twisters. I'm looking forward to a time where the Greek is not just a repeating hen over and over again. Okay, so Proposition 3. All that becomes one does so by participation of unity. For what becomes one is itself not one, but is one inasmuch as it is affected by participation in unity. So that's pretty much just a repeat of Proposition 2. Since if things which are not in themselves one should become one, they surely do so by coming together and by communication in each other, and so are subjected to the presence of unity without being unity unqualified. Insofar, then, as they undergo a process of becoming one, they participate unity. For if they already are one, they cannot become one. Nothing can become what it already is. But if, from a former not one, they become one, their unity must be due to a one which has entered into them. Okay. So that's a mouthful. There's a lot going on there. So the first point I want to make is, again, there's the repeat of Proposition 2 right at the beginning of there. And this is also an example where ontological language is used pretty heavily. So the first proposition eschewed pretty much any ontological language. And then they introduced some in Proposition 2. However, this one, Proposition 3, starts talking about being and becoming. And it does so in virtue of the nature of participation. So do with that what you will, but I did want to emphasize during the first reading that we were initially not talking about ontology. But here, it does seem a little more evident that, to own is used several times already, and genetai is used as well, which is to become. And then also language pertaining to, let's see, like being with each other, synionta and koinonunta, which is to share in common. Like kind of what we're doing right now. We're in a type of community, so that's like a koinon. If you're familiar with different dialects of Greek, Koine Greek is the common tongue. So that's where that kind of word comes from. And also, because of all this, I think we should focus a little bit on participation. One, because Rachel mentioned that she was not really sure what exactly we were talking about here, and wanted some clarification on it. And to be honest, like, I've been studying this stuff for 15 years, and I still don't quite know exactly how to put it. It's very difficult. But it has something to do with coming to be something from not being something, and basically what Proposition 3 is talking about. So that's just like the preamble about it. That's the proposition itself. As far as the argument is concerned, like, how does everyone feel about this? Like, what sticks out? Does it make sense? What doesn't make sense? Like, where are we at with this?
At risk of, like, fixating on a specific thing, but I just don't understand the last sentence.
Okay.
In quite a, like, what does it mean by a one which has entered into them?
Right. Yeah. So I think the one that has entered into them is already, let's see, agenamenotinos.
As I don't speak.
So I think this is partly a way of orienting us towards the nature of participation. That participation is, in this case, but if from a former not one they become one, their unity must be due to a one which has entered into them. So if there is something that is not one itself, but has one by the nature of participation in one, so basically it's a manifold, or it's not an unqualified one, not the one itself. So it's participating the one. It's participating unity, which is what Proposition 2 set out to or Proposition 1 and Proposition 2 set out to establish. So basically what that starts to mean then is it was in some sense formerly not one. But I also want to make sure that we're not thinking about this in temporal terms either. And which is tricky to do, because you'd think like there's a temporal succession here, but I think it's not as clear, but it is very important and will become very important later, because temporality will be introduced, but it just hasn't quite been yet. So basically we're talking about on the level of Proposition 2. So I'm going to go back to Proposition 2. So all that participates unity is both one and not one. For inasmuch as it cannot be pure unity, its participation means that it has unity as an affect and has undergone a process of becoming one. So that's the launching point. And basically what it's saying is that if this is the case, that it has undergone an affect, unity has affected it, and it has undergone a process of becoming one by virtue of participation. And this is already predefined as being a dialectical relationship between it both being one by virtue of participation and not one by requiring participation in unity for the sake of its own unity. That we're getting into this next part. And I'm not sure that clarifies anything at all. Does it? If anybody else can help to explain some of this, I'd be grateful too, because it is difficult.
I mean, the temporal stuff is a little confusing.
Right.
Because, you know, becoming versus not becoming, it's a moot point if there's no temporality, right?
I think so. At least like as far as like our basic intuitions are concerned, for sure. Because you would think if it's like, what would it mean to not be one and then become one? Were there no temporality? There's
You gotta have, yeah.
Yeah, there's never a point where it isn't one.
Right.
It's hard to say. It's really hard to say. I would say that there's a way to think about this in logical terms, though. So the way that in a syllogism, the conclusion of a syllogism is entailed by the propositions. So, all puppies are dogs, all dogs are good, therefore all puppies are good. It's the attribution of goodness onto puppies takes a sort of process. It's a type of participation in this sense. Whereas if we were to have said that all puppies are good, that would not be self-evident. But it becomes self-evident when thought through this logical process. And this process itself can also is timeless. You don't have to read the propositions in order. You don't have to think through it. You can. It's math, so it is what it is, and that's kind of it. And in that sense, there's a way to think about how the attribution of something can be timeless in that way, and that might be a useful way to frame this. But it is really making a stand here, because the only thing that is one without undergoing a process of being affected into unity is the one itself. And so everything undergoes this process. Everything undergoes this process. Everything is, in a sense, therefore, maybe a good way to think about it is everything that is participating in unity is posterior to unity in some manner, whether that's temporal or not. Oh, hey, Max, welcome. So, any other thoughts on that?
This might not make sense, but I'm going to say it out loud in case it does. But there's like a thing in like, if you're outside of temporality and so you're in like eternity, it's not the best word, but you roll with it. And then that itself is infinite. Like in an infinite thing, sort of everything exists. That's a bad way to put it. But so therefore, like everything could be both one and like end of process and processing and not one yet. Like all those things would have to be true at once, because in infinity everything would be true at once.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to think about it. I mean, like I like the idea too of thinking about it in terms of like I'm old enough that I do remember storing information on CDs and even floppy disks. Good lord. And
not that long ago.
but it is kind of true. Even a record, the impression on a record, for example, is kind of like this. It is atemporal relative to the playing of the record. That information is there all at once, and it has to. The needle has to move through the groove for you to be able to hear it, but it's all there. It's all present, all at once. And I think that is a useful way to frame this. And also, like, another way, too, at least to make sure that we're not thinking in temporal terms, is also thinking about sequence of, like, a deck of cards. You can have, like, ace, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, up to king, or if we're doing ace high, 2 to ace. However we do it, the fact is we can shuffle the deck. We can shuffle the deck, but it doesn't matter like what happens when. It doesn't matter what happens when. It doesn't matter each card we pick out 52 cards and lay them on a table. It will still exhaust all of the moments in sequence, whether it plays out in sequence or not. I'm not sure if that makes sense or not. Like I kind of think about it too, as if we were to take the entirety of space-time and slice it up and shuffle it, that no thing that exists within space-time would notice any difference. It just wouldn't. If it were playing out of sequence, it would still be experienced in sequence. And in that case, like, there's kind of a way of thinking about eternity that way. Or at the very least, thinking about the relationships between things in a non-temporal way. But again, I'm still a little stuck on this proposition, to be completely honest.
What are you stuck about? Or sorry. No, go ahead. It seems like a fairly straightforward.
Well, give it to us straight, Max. Come on.
Sure. Yeah, all that becomes one does so by participation in unity. So I know. Sorry, I'm new here. I missed the last two discussions. Anything that becomes one, participates in unity. So it wasn't one. I know you guys were talking about temporality, so I missed the beginning of the discussion. But I'm guessing that anything which isn't the one itself, if it's one in any way, it's through some participation in the one itself or in oneness without being the one. I don't know. It still feels axiomatic, I guess. Like
and I think that's basically the gist of it. And I think, and we do want to think about it in terms of like axiom, like it is axiomatically like that. I think that's a nice summary. We were talking about temporality because Capello mentioned that it's a little difficult to think about terms like coming to be one from a state of being not one outside of the bounds of temporality. So we're just kind of spitballing ways of approaching it.
I mean, doesn't becoming imply at least before and after, if not temporality, or?
Well, yeah, that's the part that we were getting.
But the point is, like, if this is outside of temporality, how does that work? That works within temporality, but it's not. It should happen outside of temporality, and then how does that work?
Sure.
So my question is, what are we getting by putting it outside of temporality?
Sorry. That's a good question. I think just keeping, because I want to keep open the possibility of what actually does follow in the text. So I'm cheating a little bit because I am projecting.
No spoilers.
I'm sorry. What was that, Capella?
I was just saying no spoilers.
I know. I am spoiling in a way. But also I want to make sure that we're not, we don't suddenly hit the wall when we get to the discussion on eternity. And then when we get to the discussion on temporality, when we start talking about the soul and being like, wait a second, I thought there was temporality in the relationship of participation between the one and the many. So how is there a temporality here that transcends eternity and eternity that transcends temporality? Like, what the hell is going on here?
So if we're talking about I'm just looking at the Greek here, the genomenon and the genetai. Yep. I mean, that is becoming, right? I mean,
yes.
Okay, so and he makes part of his argument, if they are already, I'm looking at the English, if they are already are one, they cannot become one. And so become seems to indicate at least a before and after, even if it's not temporality in the full sense of the word. It seems before and after are part of the argument here.
Yes.
Okay.
And actually, I'm looking down and I'm seeing Proposition 5 is probably going to deal with this a little more clearly.
Okay.
So maybe we're getting a little ahead of ourselves on it, but it still is a very vexing thing, especially in the Platonic tradition, where in Plato's works themselves, he's very clear, and Socrates is very clear on this relationship between like being versus becoming, and this dichotomy between Parmenides and Heraclitus, and how to kind of reconcile that. And to use the language of becoming so early. But again, the language of becoming is only really first being introduced in this proposition. And the language of ontology is only really taking shape in this proposition as well. So those are things, I think if we're not going to like resolve exactly what those mean just yet, just noticing that this is the moment that they're starting to happen in the unfolding of the argument might just be worthwhile to do. Now, Brett, I think you had something to say before. I want to make sure that.
Did I? Oh, okay. I'll imagine that I had something to say. When I was listening to Rachel's question, it seemed like part of it was not this thing we're messing with the temporality, but the question of what it would mean for the one to enter into something. Yes. Is that the odds, right? So I checked the Taylor translation. He uses a different word. He uses ingenerated, which is not the word we use. So I had to look it up because I'm like, well, how is that different than generated? And it means caused, like, right? And so one of the things I thought we might consider is that for people in this day and age, not our day and age, causation is not merely like billiard balls.
Yes.
So there are formal causes, meaning we might think of them as mathematical or geometric causes. So there's a certain sense in which the one is causing that multitude to be unified, but not by doing something, but by loaning. Maybe we could think of participation as loaning the character of oneness to that multitude.
I really appreciate that. I know Max is going to want to say something about this, Aristotelian as he is.
Yeah. I think like it's possible that something, so like take like the number 7, okay? Mm-hmm. It's manifold, it's 7, it's a number, it's a multitude, but it's also one. It's one number. So that's something that from all eternity, it of itself participates in unity. But it doesn't seem like it's the kind of thing that becomes one. So, and that's why I feel like the proposition's specifically referring to something that wasn't one and now is one. So, like, I'm making some tea right now. I'm over here, it's over there. When I start drinking it, it will become one with me, okay? But it's not right now. And so that's why when I see becoming, I do think, even again, if it's not temporality in all that means, it does still seem like at least this proposition is seeing a before and after of some sort. I don't know if that.
Well, I don't think that like what Rhett said and what you're saying, I think that's they're perfectly consistent. And I think probably Max, what you're hinting at is going to come out. I'm looking right at it. Proposition 5. Every manifold is posterior to the one. So okay. It is right there, and yeah. I think. The sense of like a sequential order in a way is there. So, but that sequence can be thought of in terms of like a formal cause, like Rhett said.
Yeah. No, I'm thinking of Aristotle's physics. I think it's a physics. He says like before and after are said in like 8 different ways. So the temporal order before and after is the one we think of the most.
Yeah.
But there's at least 7 other ways in which the ancients thought of before and after, and so that. I still am inclined to think Proposition 3 is looking at the temporal, but it seems like we're going to have to get more general or more abstract, just that for sure. So,
okay. So I wonder if we really need to make such a strong distinction between logical order and temporal order. It seems like in some circumstances we might think that he's talking about temporal order, but in other circumstances we might think he's talking about logical order, and maybe maybe I'm speculating. I
Sure.
don't know. Maybe he's not distinguishing between those two senses of order in the way that we would, right? Not that he's confused about logic and temporality,
Yeah.
right? But the thing you were saying about syllogisms earlier,
Mhm.
when you understand the syllogism, that's not, it's altogether non-temporally, right? In order to understand a proof, that moment of understanding is not first this, then this, then this, then this. Even though in order to get to that understanding, you had to go first this, then this, then this, right? So we start with the thought of a multitude, a manifold, and then we arrive at the, oh, it's a unified thing. That's how we're talking about it.
Right.
And we see that it's participating in the one, right? But that moment of seeing that is not a temporal moment. It's there it is. It's a one.
Yeah.
So maybe it would help to think of it as a process which arrives at a moment, right? It's a temporal process. Maybe I'm just speculating. It's a temporal process that arrives at an eternal moment.
Cool. I really like. Well, first of all, let's speculate, because the more we speculate, the more open our the possibilities are going to be. But also, I think that I feel very satisfied with that approach.
And there's still temporality in like the one who's coming to know, but the things themselves are unified. Does that? Okay.
Yeah,
So,
that's kind of what I'm saying.
and so knowledge happens when the one that's already in the things is present in the one coming to know.
Cool. Yeah.
Well, it doesn't exclude the possibility of something becoming one, like
Right.
your tea example,
Sure.
right?
Yeah. Right.
Everybody, where's my tea?
I have enough. Yeah.
I know it's early in the morning for you. Where's your coffee?
Well, I drank that before the call, so yeah.
All right. Well, cool. I like I said, I'm personally very satisfied with that. With just keeping it open in that way. I think that's great. So obviously this is happening through a process, and the process is participation. It's methexai, which this is the thing I also wanted to make sure we spend some time with, because however we think about sequence, it's being done through participation. So what the hell is participation? As far as the Greek is concerned, it's we've got the preposition meta, which is to be with or to be after in sequence. It doesn't imply a type of sequence. When it's used in the accusative case, it's typically in sequence, or if it's used in the genitive case, it's typically used as like in common, or like I guess the distinction between one and then two versus like X and Y on a graph. That's kind of the way we can think about it. And I think this form of meta that's being used seems to be more like the one on the graph, like the X and the Y on the axis. And then there's echo, which is to have. So like quite literally it means to have with or to have beside. And echo is also a word that has a lot of different meanings, because it means to possess, it means to grab hold of, it also means to be. Kind of the way that in French, for example, if you say how old you are, you say I have this many years. It has that meaning too. And then its combination, it does kind of fuse those two ideas together. I'm going to go ahead and share the Liddell. Let me see. Not the Liddell Scott. We're going to do the middle. Blah blah blah. All right, present something else. Just a second.
Middle.
Here we go. Yeah, the middle little, because Liddell Scott is very wordy. So we've got, that's echo. That's not the one I wanted to share. Let me make sure I'm sharing the right one first. My bad. Okay. So this is basically the definition that we have on the Perseus text. This is the middle Liddell version, which is Meteko is to partake of, enjoy a share of, share in, take part in. So it gives examples of to partake in friendship, to be members, and to share something in common. So we can also think of ourselves as participating, and like we are all participants in this present group, and that would be an appropriate meaning for the Greek term too. So that is kind of like a practical way to think about it, just like in action. That's what's happening right now in this group. It's one, we're all participating in it. And it's also a technical term in Platonism, which has to do with something participating in something else, like we've been talking about with every manifold participating in the one. So deriving its oneness, in a sense almost borrowing its oneness from something else. And maybe that's another way to think about it too, is like taking from or borrowing, or Plato also goes at length in the Parmenides to really deconstruct the possibility of partaking without taking anything of what it's taking from, if that makes sense. So the way that we're like, right now it's 9 p.m. here. So I am participating in the night in a way, but the night loses nothing by my participation in it. So that's a kind of example that he uses in the first half of the Parmenides to talk about this relationship too. So whatever is being participated does not take anything from, in an essential way, from the thing that it participates from or with. So, and that makes sense too when it comes to things like friendship. If we're participating in friendship, you're not losing something. Yes, please.
I've always heard participation described as dependence and likeness. So like those two qualities come together. So yeah, there's a way in which the thing participating depends on the thing participated in, and the effect of that dependence is some kind of likeness to it. So
I think that's good. Yeah, I think, okay, so this is silly. So right here we have a light, right? We got a light. And
Silly.
now we have the light passing through my fingers. And now my finger takes on this certain type of glow when it's participating of the light. And the nature of its participation, it's almost like the light itself is not affected by this, but it can obstruct it. But we see the light through the finger, and it takes on different qualities because of that. It's now a little orange where it was white before, and it's bright where there is a perforation, and it's darker where there isn't. It illuminates through the thinner portions of skin and has a little more trouble passing through where there's more muscle and bone. And so that is kind of an example of how participation does work. At least that's just a very simple illustrative example. But again, the light itself is just the light. And if we think about one and many in that same way, that the one is kind of unaffected in that way. But there's a dependency. The light and the glow and the translucency of my hands is only present when the light is behind it and illuminating it.
Makes sense to me.
Does anybody else have any wild out there examples of this kind of thing? Because I like the weirder the better.
I think you gave a really normal example, which is fine.
A normal one, okay.
Like St. Thomas uses always the example of the sun. He's it's the hottest thing, it's the brightest thing. So everything else is some participant in that. It seems. Knowledge would seem to be another clear case where you know a thing through having a likeness of it in your mind, which depends on that thing as well. for your knowledge to be true. It has to depend on it, correspond to it in some way. So knowledge, coming into knowledge is coming into that likeness, that unity with the thing known.
Yeah, I like that. Any other thoughts on this participation thing?
Sure, I'll have a thought. I'm super inclined this way, but I'm trying to I'm wondering why this strategy for thinking about things became unpopular. Right? So I was just reading some book which had a big focus on Aquinas and this creator-creation relationship, which is much like what we're talking about, right? The creation is dependent on the creator, but the creator is not dependent on the creation. And then after Thomas, this kind of stuff, which comes from Pseudo-Dionysius and all this, gets dropped. And we move toward a different strategy. And clearly there's a contemporary way of thinking about these things doesn't quite go this way. People don't say, oh, this organism that we're studying is one because of its participation in the one. We tend to think that its oneness is actually a feature of it, not something that it's getting from somewhere else. And as I said, I'm super sympathetic to this, the way we're talking about it. But this is no wondering why that view, like, why are we even struggling with this at all? Surely if we had been ancient Greeks, we would have been like, oh yeah, of course, there are these entities that are abstract in the concretely abstract way, and things participate in them. Let's move along.
Right.
Like,
I do think.
Go ahead, Max.
I think like mathematical equality is more useful as far as like things go. So like you think of like Newton, he figured out like universal gravitation and figuring out like that there's an equality somewhere between, say, like some constant
mass times acceleration.
Yeah, all that. Yeah, for example, or like Maxwell equations. Okay, once people figured those out, they're like, wow, that's how electricity and magnetism work, and we can manipulate that. Okay, whereas when we're talking about like lower things like creatures and higher things like the one, we can't manipulate that, and so I think there becomes less interest in general over time when they're like, well, I can't manipulate. By
useful, you mean manipulatable.
What's that?
I'm just
yeah.
By useful, basically. You mean manipulatable, right?
Basically,
so we move toward a more control-oriented rather than understanding-oriented strategy.
Yeah, and Francis Bacon.
Eventually, we arrive in the mid-20th century where we say metaphysics is useless. Let's stop doing it. And
like, well, metaphysics is useless.
Logical positivism here.
Sure. No, I mean, metaphysics is useless in the sense that it's the highest of all things and all things are ordered to it. So yes, of course, it's not going to serve something beneath it, And so I'm like, that's why it's the highest thing and it's worth studying. But
right.
people don't buy that. They're like, no, make me money, turn stuff into gold. And metaphysics doesn't do that. So, yeah.
Wow. Really? I've really a lot of time then.
As far as I know.
Turn things into gold.
Yeah.
I guess I'm going to have to return all that.
It could still happen.
Yeah. Well, Francis Bacon, he's the only one I know who talks about, he goes through each of the sciences and talks about their speculative and practical parts.
Right.
And I remember reading his stuff on practical metaphysics. And I'm like, what is he even talking about? But someone there claimed to have it. And he's like, yeah.
A contradiction in terms.
I know. But he's like, it doesn't work. So we'll just cast this off. Like, well, I'm not surprised it doesn't work, but I'm also wondering where you got it from. So,
isn't that just alchemy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's along those lines. That's kind of what he's thinking. So, but
yeah, I don't know if I agree. Like, ethically, is ethically the right word? It doesn't matter. With your point that like it's worth studying regardless. Like, and the reason for not studying it is individualistic, capitalist, the desire for things to have utility, etc. But I'm not sure I agree that it is not useful even by that standard, right? Like that assumes especially actually to go back to this argument, a simple line of causality rather than like we know that's not like even just like the most prosaic obvious things are an interconnected web. A thing I kept thinking about with this, which isn't a particularly interesting example, but is like food, like in the process of like digestion being like a thing of this anyway. But that's kind of a good example where if you even just try and draw out the strings of that, that's a massive web. And I'm not sure like this certainly as an argument, but also like I don't know experientially like isn't just like divinity down. Like it's way more. I think you can, and like alchemy is a good example. There you go. That's like an easy one, like in a way. So I'm not actually convinced, like even by those standards, it is like useless. But I think that there's a certain kind of like post-enlightenment idea that by those standards it is useless. That then with the capitalist selfishness gets layered, and then we end up where we like with the original question of like. Why don't people
Isn't
think
part of its uselessness that we've actually settled all the metaphysical questions?
Yeah, we're done.
Meaning the world is made out of atoms. They have relationships that we can characterize mathematically. Pleasure and happiness are the same thing. And we're not going to question those things because we know they're right.
We got it.
And so,
but also like a crazy, like just basic physics version of that we know we don't understand, like physicists know we don't understand, is that like some atoms behave differently based on our conscious experience of them. Like that's just a thing. And no one knows why. Like it's mad. So that again, that's kind of I was also thinking about that a bit in terms of the like again, I don't think as far as we can discern cause effect. Again, I come back to the point about ignoring temporality for this, but like cause effect. It's not one straight line. Like things are intersecting with each other like all the time.
Max has got his complete works of Aristotle.
All right.
Is that what that is?
Which I now can't.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, she's right.
I recognize the grammar.
So at least when like Aristotle talks about like metaphysics being useless, I don't know if he uses those exact terms, but he thinks of the useful. Another word for useful is instrumental. Okay, so if something's useful, it's a tool or an instrument for arriving at something else. Okay.
Right.
But he holds that metaphysics is about the highest things, and it's the act of doing it, or the act of apprehending the object of metaphysics that is the most end-like. It's the most complete thing we do.
Yeah.
So it can't be. In fact, if it was useful, that is instrumental, then it's not what we're looking for. We want something beyond it. And so again, obviously there are useless things that are just like not good for anything. Okay, this isn't good at all. But when he's talking about metaphysics as useless, it's the kind of thing that's not good for anything else. Rather, everything else is good to the extent that it leads to this.
Right.
Okay.
That's
Or God.
The good is not good for something.
Yeah, it's
That
so
would
there are
imply
some
that
goods
there
that are
was
good.
another thing that was good, better than the good.
Right.
The good was in service of. Right.
Yeah.
Now, I will say, anybody who's participating in the theology discussion may find that ultimately there might be a usefulness to this.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree, but I think that's interesting. And I think like also I can't hear Aristotle anymore without getting Taylor Swift stuck in my head. It's not your fault, but deeply irritating. She references Aristotle on a new song in a really dumb line.
In Midnights?
You can Google that later for yourself.
Which song?
Possibly don't. Possibly don't for your own sanity. Anyway, apologies.
Can I ask which song? I'm curious.
The difference between something is good full stop, as it were, and something is good for insert continuation is an important.
Yeah.
Like that's like useful.
I'm just thinking like, I mean, so like the ultimate good, I don't know if I'll say God, but like the one probably, I think we'll get there soon enough. He's not good because he's like, oh, he's going to help me be wealthy, or he's going to help me be strong or pretty, but like because he's goodness itself. So like his goodness doesn't depend on anything or rely on anything. It's just that's goodness. So then everything else which is good in some way only has it because it either leads to him or participates him or it in some way.
That's quite no, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't phrase it like that because Aristotle came first. but that clearly led to a lot of Christian thinking.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I think
That has a deeply
Sure.
like church.
Christians are very comfortable, I think, with the way like Aristotle or Plato would
Yeah.
talk about those goods in that way, for sure. Yeah. So,
Well, classical theists in general.
Yeah.
Christian or otherwise.
yeah, Islam, yeah, all that.
And plus, Platonism already has a trinity. It's got the one, the beautiful, and the good.
Pretty to think so.
All right. So how we feeling about Proposition 3? Do we feel brave enough? There's only like 12 minutes left. I don't know that it's worth
It
jumping
said
into.
15 on my screen, but okay.
Okay.
We had this problem last time.
We did. Yes. Yeah.
I still can't remember what our question was, though.
What's the problem? Or no? I wasn't here. I've never been here, so just
They just don't.
There was a-
their
there was a-
screens are not synced.
There's a
That's not
timer.
big problem.
oh, sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is literally people not setting their watches synchronously is the problem.
But there was also a question we had about Proposition 2 where we were like, well, should we move to 3? And we didn't have time because there were only 15 minutes left. And we're like, we'll just talk about it next time. But now I can't remember what the question was.
So let's just go back and look at 2 then before
Well,
we.
I feel bad for sending us backwards rather than forwards.
no.
That's
but-
fine. Well, that's inevitable in this, surely.
Yeah, okay. For inasmuch as it cannot be pure unity, since participation in unity implies a distinct participant, its participation means that it has unity as an affect, and has undergone a process of becoming one. Now, if it be nothing else but its own unity, it is a bare one, and so cannot participate unity, but must be pure unity. But if it has some character other than oneness, in virtue of that character, it is not one, and so not unity unqualified. Thus, being one, and yet, as participating unity, in itself not one, it is both one and not one. It is in fact unity with something added, and is in virtue of the additional not one, although one is affected by unity. Everything, therefore, which participates unity is both one and not one. Okay.
That does make more sense with 3.
It does, doesn't it?
You were
Yeah.
right.
I still can't remember what our question was. I know that we were sort of like, well, okay, there's 2 different ways we can look at this, and how, what way we want to do sort of depends kind of on how we read 3. I can't remember what the 2 ways. I should take notes, really, but
I should have recorded is the thing.
there you go. It's your fault.
It is my fault. I'll take the blame.
I'll take a swing at it. I'm probably wrong, but I'll take a swing anyway. There seemed like there was a phenomenological way of reading it, where the oneness was more at the subjective side, and then a more objective. This is more like, I guess I was confused by the non-ontology thing. This is what he's talking about is the way it is, independent of whether we're there to notice or not, right? So there's the Kantian, the oneness is coming from us. And then there's more the Platonic version where the oneness is really there, independent of us. I wondered if that was the direction that the question was going in, because I don't know what it is.
The oneness is the call coming from inside the house. Yeah, we did have the discussion about that. I think at the very least, I remember kind of settling on not so much approaching it one way or the other, but just allowing, just giving the space to think about the relationship of participation of unity in both directions, with no commitment as to the ultimate nature of whether we're thinking about the one in objective or subjective terms, or their combination, or neither.
Okay, so that wasn't the question.
I do, at least in Prop 2, I could see like temporality coming up, wondering if becoming is part of it, whereas it doesn't seem to rely on that at all. Whereas 3, at least to me, explicitly talks about becoming, so at least the before and after.
Yes. So, that's a
thing.
good question, because that's kind of how we started talking about this first one too, because there is a lot of becoming language in Proposition 3. Genitai appears first in Proposition 2. And it also has, I mentioned before, Peponthe and affect, where we're already talking about kind of, at the very least, some affective relationship that participation has with that which participates. Anything that participates is in some way affected by virtue of participation, and its affect is its unity. Which also like has a type of process of becoming one. Yeah, so this is the first time that that's introduced, and it's introduced, or becoming is introduced, and becoming is introduced in relationship to affect as well. So I think that's interesting. Just interesting to note, at least.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys like talked about like examples, I guess, of things participating in unity, but like numbers for some reason are the ones that come to mind right away. Like every number is both 1 and not 1.
Yeah.
Like 2 is obviously not 1, otherwise it would be 1, but it's also one number, and then you could say that 3 or 4 or 5, so they participate in unity, or they wouldn't be one number, but they're also not 1, or they wouldn't be 2 or 3 or 4. So that's the example, the first one. There are other ones, but I don't know.
Yeah, and the examples I was giving last time were ones pertaining to like thoughts, feelings, the body, things like that, which also participate unity and are themselves a multiplicity. The mind is a multiplicity, and it participates in unity. Not sure what that unity is, but it is a multiplicity that participates in unity.
I mean, anything with dimension. Also, I mean, like my body, like I've got a head, I've got toes, all that stuff. but it's one body, but it's not merely one, because it has diversity and multitude and has all these parts. And I got 10 toes actually, and things like that. So
congratulations.
I got my fingers, the multiplicity, which also make up my hand, which is also a multiplicity with hands. And
just to be a pain about this,
please.
I have 4 pens and a pencil and a notebook and my computer, keyboard and whatever, and the book. Is that a unity?
I think you just made it one.
We always call that a logical unity. Like it doesn't seem to naturally have any
set.
Yeah, so it doesn't seem to have any unity.
It doesn't actually have any
natural unity
character that makes it a unity. The unity is things sitting in front of me on my desk.
Well, I'm gonna throw out a left field one and bring up David Lewis and mereology, and that there is an object that is those things and the Eiffel Tower, and only those things in the Eiffel Tower.
Yeah, and that just seems like David Lewis needed to drink less coffee.
Yeah, I do think like if they have any unity, it's only from the fact that you said like all these things. Well, what unifies them? The fact that they are these things, the ones you decided to unify.
Yeah, right, exactly. That's a purely subjective unity.
Yeah, because you handed us that unity. You gave it to us as an object.
It's a transjective unity. It's not. It doesn't exist without me. Whereas my dog's unity does not require me pointing it out for the dog to be unified.
He remains.
I'm not sure. I mean,
it's good.
I don't know about that. I mean, like, so to even conceive of unity as a thing, right?
No.
Like your dog doesn't. Like the concept of unity doesn't really give any benefit to your dog, right? It just sort of is.
That's assuming a lot about the animal experience that I don't think is like necessarily true.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Is
I'm just saying my dog can distinguish between one treat and 2 treats pretty easily.
Or itself and others.
Like you have one dog. If someone's like, "Well, do you have one dog?" You'd be like, "Yes, I have one dog."
Right.
So there's something consistent about the unity. and it's
Right.
rooted in the nature of the dog. I would, if I were to go a step further.
But to be fair to the, can we tell if there's one dog? That wasn't the point. The point was, is there a unity in the dog if we divorce our own consciousness from it? Like, I'm arguing yes, but the point isn't about us. The point is, like, can unity exist without us? But I think the dog is aware of its own unity. Like, the dog knows what's it and what's not it. So I think
it's not aware. I don't know. Like a tree. A tree's not aware of its unity, but it's you got one tree there. Or even like a dog who's asleep, he's not aware of his unity.
There's a bit of fuzziness with it, and even the nature of using tools introduces a complication, because when you become an expert in the use of a tool, this is Heidegger. When you become an expert in the use of the tool, it does, in a sense, become a part of your bodily unity.
Artificial it's a joke everyone makes with phones now, right?
Like it's one house. Okay, well, a house it's an artificial reality, but it still has a kind of unity to it. Like I know I don't live in two houses. I don't live in half a house. I live in a house. And so like that it's a unity that's conferred on it by an artificer. So like it's not natural, but I don't think it's crazy to call it one. I think it's probably less one than like the way a dog is one, I think. I would say that in my mind is one, but
some unities are more natural than others. But there's underlying patterns that allow us to be more capable of observing unity versus others. But unity, the ability to count, the ability to enumerate, the ability to distinguish between the one and the many, it seems like there's a cognitive component to that does not exist outside of some sort of, I don't know, discerning thing. It doesn't necessarily have to be human, but
I also think, at the very least, at this level of the discussion, natural or not, less real or more real, unity is unity, and it's just as true. It's still participation in unity. It's just in some way. That's what that P to Henos, in some way of the one.
So there can be a more or less.
I think so. But at the very least, it's some way. It's some way.
Yeah.
And that seems to be enough for Proclus, at least, to start the entire unfolding of this idea.
Okay.
No, it's relevant. I think dogs are more one than plants are. Like,
go for it.
You can cut a dog in two, and then you don't have any dogs anymore. Okay, because it's one thing. Whereas like a plant, you could cut in two, and now you have two plants. So like it
depends on the plant.
There's something flexible about its unity in a way that dogs aren't. So again, it's just like, but I think Rowan's right. Like it's this point is much more general and would apply to all of that, any of that for sure. So yeah.
Cool. So I'm gonna sign off this one. If anybody wants to join for a post discussion, I'll get that one fired up.
Very good.
Be back
okay.